I want to welcome everyone today. It's a very warm July day, and we're going to have a talk today by Mr. Stephen Cook from United Hospitals Coventry and Warwickshire, who's going to talk to us about the Gait cycle. Now, just a few things beforehand. I will just want to mention about another course that's coming up. Bear with me. On the 28th of August, case discussions for the orthopaedic exam. Just to get with the advent of the clinical stations being virtual, we're trying to get a few more courses where people can have a chance to practice going through how you go through case-based discussions. So hopefully this will be helpful towards the clinical part of the exam. And there's a course being run through the Orthopaedic Academy on the 28th of August. Okay. Let me just stop share. Right. And just a few words to say about Mr. Cook. So he's trained in Edinburgh and has been working as a consultant at Coventry Hospitals since 2011. In the paediatric department with a special interest in cerebral palsy, and has been running a Gait lab at UHCW for some time. I was very lucky when I was doing my paediatric fellowship to work with Mr. Cook and found a valuable experience. He explained the Gait cycle very well. I just wish I'd had the chance to use it in the exam. Unfortunately, they didn't ask me about it. He also has been the National BTO Trainer of the Year in 2012. And so, without further ado, I'll pass you on to Mr. Cook. Okay.
Thanks very much, David. That was a very generous introduction. So, and thanks for inviting me to chat to you guys. As David said, my main subspecialty interest is cerebral palsy, and as part of that, as most of you are aware, gait analysis forms a fairly integral part. So I've designed this talk in sort of 2 or 3 sections. The first bit's just a little bit of fun, really, just background of Gait and a little bit about why I find it so interesting, and then we'll get into a bit of the nitty-gritty about the Gait cycle, and then we'll hopefully end on a bunch of cases so you guys get used to talking about Gait, particularly for the exam, but also it's useful for your practice in the long term. All right, so bipedal walking is actually surprisingly recent. So it's been a couple of million years or so since bipedal walking started, and compare that with quadrupedal walking, which was something like nearly 360 million years ago, was the first quadruped on land. So there have been some evolutionary adaptations to our anatomy and physiology to allow for bipedal walking, but it's no way near as well adapted as quadrupedal walking. And these are a few of them. So we have a wider pelvis, we have much longer lower limb bones, greater lever arms. They're thicker. Our knee joints in particular are much thicker, same with ankles, and we've got adapted feet and so forth to accommodate it. However, there are some things that are particularly unusual. So in order for us to walk upright, if we didn't have this large thoracic kyphosis, all of our organs and heavy bits would be too far forwards, our center of mass would be too far forwards, and we'd be constantly toppling forwards. We're using muscles to keep ourselves erect. So we've developed this big thoracic kyphosis to keep the chest back and to keep the center of mass over the hips. But then because that's got a kyphosis, you then need to have a lordosis in your neck and a lordosis in your lumbar spine. And this is probably the origin of most back pain problems in humans. Now compare that to a great ape that's just got this die straight back from head to coccyx, completely straight. So that's how you would design it back if you could. But because we now work on all fours, we've got these adaptations. So some are good, like the big legs and the big knees and the long muscles and the long lever arms. Some aren't so good, like the 3 curves we've now got in our spine. There are also some non-skeletal adaptations. So our muscles, particularly our lower limb and our anti-gravity muscles, are much stronger. The muscle composition is different. So whereas great apes have got a much more higher percentage of fast twitch fibers for explosive power, we've got a lot more of the sort of slow twitch fibers for strength and for endurance. And we've also got a number of neurological changes to allow this to work. We're also incredibly good at it. It takes a baby around about a year to walk, and by around about age 6 to 8, we walk like adults. We can run, hop, skip, jump, we can climb up and down things, we can go over just about any terrain, and we can do it for ages. We can walk and walk and walk. But we don't really know how it works. There's a surprisingly little amount we know. So this is the stuff we do know. We know about the anatomy. We know where every bone is. We know where every joint is. We know where every muscle is. I know the knee surgeons come up with a new structure in the posterolateral corner every year, but generally speaking, we know where everything is. We know where the nerves are. We know where the muscles and tendons are. We know how these things work in fairly intimate detail. And we've actually got some fairly good models of how humans walk, and it's the so-called double inverted pendulum. So that's a pendulum. That's an inverted pendulum. There's a double pendulum. And there's a double inverted pendulum. So this is your kind of your foot down here, your knee, your hip, and then obviously you've got head, arms, trunk above that. So actually, we're not a double pendulum, we're a triple pendulum. And so this is a triple pendulum in action. And one of the things to sort of notice is how chaotic the movement of the points below the single pendulum are. So the single pendulum's arc is utterly predictable. There's a mathematical equation that will describe that with perfect precision. And any point of time in the future, you know exactly where that's going to be. But now if you look at the absolutely crazy movement, particularly of the little bottom ball on the right hand, it just goes all over the shop. It's inherently chaotic. Now, chaos isn't random. We'll talk about that in a second, but it is very, very, very hard to predict. And as I said, we're not just a normal pendulum, we're an inverted pendulum, and it's more complicated than that. So this model, for example, models the head, arms, and trunk as a single bar, but we're not. Our spine moves, our arms move, our head moves on our neck. This is obviously a sagittal plane, and this equation up here on the top right is just the equation of state for the movement at the ankle. And that's only in 2 planes. That's only in the sagittal, only 1 plane, sorry, sagittal plane. We haven't even thought about coronal or axial planes yet. So it's insanely complex. And remember, chaos isn't random. Chaos is a deterministic system, but where arbitrarily small perturbations lead to huge differences in eventual outcomes. So just to go back to that triple pendulum model, you can change the initial state of the pendulum by orders of the width of an atom, and it will have a large effect on the movement of the distal part. So it is deterministic, but very unpredictable. There are I said, these are some quite good models of how things work. Most of you will be familiar with Asimo, the Honda model. They've kind of retired that now, and more recently, this dude, Atlas, Boston Dynamics, and these robots can do phenomenal things. This thing can run, it can jump, it can do all sorts of acrobatics. It can get up if it's knocked over. It can do all sorts of quite cool things. And you sort of think, all right, we must have sorted how we walk then, because if we can make something that does this, then surely we must know everything about walking. But there's lots and lots of problems, and the big problem is we just don't know how the control mechanism works in humans. We don't know how everything is put together. And this is just to give you an illustration of why we don't know, why it's so complicated. So in medical school, we're taught that muscles can effectively pull, and they're kind of on or off. But muscles are much, much more complex than that. So let's take the gastroc, which is a fascinating muscle. So gastroc originates above the knee on the back of the femur, passes behind the knee. It's got a muscular portion. It's got an aponeurotic portion. Its aponeurosis then turns into a tendon, which inserts onto the tendon or the aponeurosis of another completely different muscle. Then it goes down and forms the conjoined Achilles tendon, which then passes behind the ankle joint and behind the subtalar joint before it inserts into the calcaneus. So this muscle's got an incredibly complex anatomical arrangement crossing 3 joints. It's got 2 different parts, medial and lateral, and each of those parts can be activated in a myriad of different ways. You can activate it with incredible precision. One of the quite cool things to do, so if those of you who drive, next time you go for a drive, please make sure there is no one behind you, but try braking with your left foot compared to your right. It's really, really hard to do. So you've trained your gastroc over the years and soleus to a certain extent to provide perfect, really exquisite control over the pressure it can do. And that's how it works during walking. So the muscle isn't just on or off. Different parts of it can be on or off. Different parts of it can activate at different rates. Different fibers within the muscle can be activated at different times. And this is one of the things that I'll hopefully try and convince you all how this works by the end of the teaching session. Even though this muscle passes behind the knee, so you think it should flex it, it is one of the most potent knee extenders during gait. And that's mainly because of momentum, the ground reaction vector, and the fact it depends upon the state of the other joints it passes and the other muscles. So I'm going to go over that again because that's really, really important towards the end. It's also mind-numbingly energy efficient. And just to sort of illustrate this, humans take around about 2.5 joules per kilogram per meter of walking. So if you take an 80-kilo person, and I pick that because that's roughly what Atlas, that robot, weighs a little bit more actually. So you take an 80-kilogram person walking at about standard walking pace, we use around about 1 million joules an hour, whereas Atlas uses over 13 million joules for the same hour of walking. So it's over an order of magnitude more efficient as human walking, so around about 15 times more efficient. And again, just to put that into a sort of real world example, imagine those of you who have Teslas, about 300 miles on a charge. So if Tesla's batteries were as efficient as humans, you go 5,000 miles on a charge. So there's a big gulf in understanding between sort of robotic walking, if you like, and human walking. This is what our Gait lab looks like. So it's a long, thin room with a bunch of motion detecting cameras around the ceiling, some force plates in the middle that measure the ground reaction force. This is my son, Harry. When we were opening up the lab, we had to get a bunch of inverted commas normal patients in the lab to walk around and provide our normal data set. So he's got a number of markers which are placed on the bony prominences, and these are placed in very specific ways. It takes our therapists quite a while to learn exactly how to put these markers on and where to put them. Because if you think about it, we're trying to build a skeletal model based upon the skin. And so we have to put these on in the right place. There are some places that are easy, like ASIS, dead easy to find them, dead easy to find the medial and lateral malleoli, much harder actually to find the center of the knee joints, particularly on the lateral. So it isn't easy to do, but and that's one of the drawbacks I think of gait analysis, is getting the markers on in the right place. But anyway, that's what we do. And then we get them walking up and down the labs. So let me I found out this works better actually if I'm not in presentation mode. All right, so this is Harry walking up and down the lab, and you can see he's got a bunch of markers on. The little black boxes that you see, if I pause it, these are surface EMG, so we can pick up very crude, just on the flexor and extensor compartments. So we can pick up a bit of EMG data as well. And you walk up and down the lab. Then next thing you want to do is pick up the ground reaction force. So this is Newton's third law in action. So Newton's third law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So as Harry walks across the lab, if I go to say mid stance here, this arrow is his ground reaction force. And the way it's set up in the lab is that the size of the arrow is the magnitude of the force. Remember, a force is a vector, so that's the size, and obviously the direction of the arrow is the direction of the force. And you can see how it moves throughout the gait cycle from initial contact through to toe off. And if you don't think like a surgeon for a bit, just think like a physicist or an engineer. It's this force that is responsible for the external moments around your leg. So this force times the distance there is the moment around the knee. This force times the distance there is the moment around the ankle. If you trace that up towards the hip, that's the moment there. So this data here, this ground reaction force, is what's allowing the computer to calculate the moments. And from that, we can also calculate the power. So this is going through. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on this bit, just going through the bits of the gait cycle. So you've got initial contact. Initial contact is a point in time. And initial contact should be with the heel. So you can see Harry's got a normal heel strike. Then you get load response, the knee bending and the foot becoming flat. So it's very, very quick. This is 25 frames a second. So literally only about 2 frames between heel strike and foot flat. So very, 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 very quick. And this is a so-called first rocker in terms of ankle movement, or it's called load response in terms of the gait cycle. It's also called first double support because you've got both feet on the ground. And at this point here, your foot is allowed to contact the ground in a controlled way under the eccentric control of tibialis anterior and your toe extensors. So this EMG here will be firing like crazy as Harry's tibant is firing, eccentrically allowing the foot to hit the ground in a controlled way. Without that, you get kind of a foot slapping. I've unmuted myself. Someone said the host muted me. Someone muted me. Anyway, I hope that wasn't personal. Maybe the talk was shit so far and they decided that's it. Anyway, assuming I'm unmuted now, I'll carry on. Someone please tell me if they can't hear me. All right, so first rocker or load response. Then as the foot is now flat on the ground, and obviously as the foot's flat, the tibia is advancing across the foot. And so the ankle is dorsiflexing. So from that point there to that point there, the ankle is dorsiflexing. And the ankle is dorsiflexing in a controlled way. We don't want this to happen too quickly, because otherwise it can get all sorts of gait problems. So gastroc here now is, tiband is now turned off, and gastroc and soleus are now firing. So this EMG would be starting to register a response. And again, it's eccentric. So gastroc is contracting, 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 loading up that Achilles tendon. Look at Harry's Achilles tendon. It's under a lot of tension there, building up all that elastic potential energy, preventing the tibia falling forwards too rapidly. And at this point here, so look here. So at this point here, the ground reaction vector is behind the knee, but at this point here, it's now in front of the knee. And that's now causing an extending moment. I'm going to go through this again because this is really important. The knee is now extending. That's happening passively just to this point here. So let's go over that again. So foot flat, ankle is now dorsiflexing. Gastroc is contracting like crazy to prevent the tibia moving forward too fast. Ground reaction vector moves through the center and then in front of the knee. Knee starts extending to this point here. And you can just see it now. The origin of the ground reaction vector is right at the front, right in between first and fifth metatarsal heads. All of Harry's weight now is through the forefoot. The heel is just about to lift off the ground. And then you get this explosive plantar flexion of the ankle to push the limb forwards. All the textbooks say this is concentric contraction of your gastrosoleus. And you should say that in the exam, because all the examiners believe that too. But actually, it's actually mostly passive in normal walking at normal speed. Partly because during this phase of gait cycle, you're building up the elasticity in your Achilles tendon. And actually at this point here in normal walking at normal speed, not running, not jumping, it's just elastic recoil that causes that plantar flexion and the forward propulsion there. So actually gastroc isn't very active there. But generally speaking, the textbooks, third rocker or the end or terminal stance pre-swing is concentric contraction of your gastroc. That pushes that leg forward for swing phase. And it might say you don't really need your hip flexors much in swing phase. It's just all propulsion from the gastroc. Right, so I'm going to go through this again a bit. Let's just go back to presentation modes. This is just a little word about how the ground reaction, one of the ways you can think about the ground reaction vector. So imagine this person's leg was just suspended in the air. If I push on the foot in that direction, I think you'll all agree that's going to extend the knee. So if I push that way, the knee's going to straighten. And the magnitude of the moment is the force, so whatever that force is, times the perpendicular distance, so not this distance here, not that distance there, the perpendicular distance to the center of rotation of the knee. So force times distance, moment, Newton meters. And as long as that arrow is in front of the knee, it will always try and straighten the knee. It doesn't even matter how close it will get. Obviously that distance is much less, so that force times distance is much, much less, the moment is less, but that's still an extending moment. So if I push on the foot in that direction, it will try and straighten the knee. Not as much as if I pushed on it in that direction, but it's still going to straighten the knee. And as soon as that ground reaction vector goes behind the knee, it becomes a flexing moment. So now, Harry, or whoever's weight bearing, if you stand like that, that's a flexing moment, and it's that force times that distance. Okay, so ground reaction vector in front of the knee is an extending moment. Ground reaction vector behind the knee is a flexing moment. So this is where I'm going to try and convince you how gastroc extends the knee. Right, so remember we said in second rocker, it's your gastrocnemius and your soleus is firing like crazy to stop your tibia going forwards. So if you've got momentum taking your body forwards, but your tibia is being kept in check, then it stands to reason your knee is going to extend. And the way we can map that is by showing where the ground reaction vector is. So look at Harry's knee. At the end of load response, the knee is relatively bent, around about 30 degrees or so. The ground reaction vector at this point is behind the knee. It's a flexing moment. So the only thing that's going to stop that flexing is quads. So at this point in load response, quads is active. It's surprisingly not active that much. You only need around about 10 to 15% of your maximum contraction of your quads in normal walking, but there is a little flicker of quads activity. Then you get to this point here in dead mid stance. So in mid stance now, Harry's ground reaction vector is right through the center of the knee. So there is no moment, there's zero moment because there is no distance. So there can't be a moment if there's no distance. So at this point here, knee flexion is now stopped. And as soon as I go one frame forwards, it's now an extending moment. It's a tiny moment because that distance is very small, but it's an extending moment. And if I go through a few more frames, it gets a little bigger, a little bigger. Now watch what happens to Harry's knee knee flexion, knee extension, knee flexion, knee extension. Not because quads is extending the knee. Quads is completely off now. This in normal gait, this EMG will be silent. This is entirely due to the ground reaction vector being in front of the knee, and the only thing that controls that is your gastroc. So your gastroc is extending your knee. Even though the heart is behind your knee, it's a potent knee extender. And this is something called the plantar flexion knee extension couple, the PFKE couple. So it's your ankle plantar flexors that are controlling your knee extensors. And it's incredibly important concept. And when we're prescribing orthotics for gait improvement and tuning them, this is one of the primary things, one of the first things I'm looking at is where is this line going during stance phase? And I'll show you, I've got plenty of examples of pathological gait where that's been disordered. Plantar flexion, knee extension couple. From mid stance to terminal stance, knee is going from flexion to extension, quadriceps is completely off, gastroc is firing, extending the knee. Right. If anyone doesn't understand that, put it in a question and we'll go over it again at the end. It's one of the most important concepts when you're prescribing orthotics. All right, let's skip on a phase. So this is now the next phase of gait analysis. And now we've got Harry walking and we've got the ground reaction vector. The computer can build up a wire model and then we can dispense with Harry altogether. And now we've got the wire model. And the advantage of this, I can't show you on this because this is just a static video, but in the gait lab, we can rotate this around. We can look at any plane from top to bottom, side to side. It's an entirely computer representation of where those dots are, what those dots are. And from this, we can calculate joint ranges, moments, powers, and all the other stuff that you'll have seen when you've seen gait graphs. So this is the kind of the raw data, if you like. But obviously, we need to get that into a form that we can understand. So let's just go to this. And you guys may have seen graphs like this. And this is how we present it in the lab. So on the left-hand column here, you've got our kinematics. So this is just the movement of the joints. And we've got various conventions. So in our lab, red is left and blue is right, like the political spectrum. But other labs do it differently, so you have to be a little bit careful. If you're in the exam, it will be labeled. You will be told which is which. Almost all gait graphs that I've ever seen have got a grey bar. This is our normal values in our lab. So remember, I took Harry through my lab. We had 20 kids through the lab of varying different ages. And this is our normal. So you should in the exam also get a normal bar, and that's the grey bar, what normally happens. So that gives you a bit of a step up in terms of interpreting these graphs because you already know what's normal. And then, as I said, these are usually averages. And then, so this is the kinematics, just the movement. These are now moments. These two sets of graphs are on the right-hand side, are the next two columns are the moments. This is the kinetics. So these are now the joint forces. And this is moment, and this is power. So moment, as we said, you all know what moments are. They're force times perpendicular distance. What most people don't understand, and I won't spend too long on it because I don't think it's important for the exam, is what power means. So when we talk about power in orthopedics, we're often talking about like muscle strength. You know, I've got power 3 out of 5 or power 4 out of 5. That's not what we mean by power in gait analysis. This is true physical power, joules per second, watts. And those of you who are familiar with cars and so forth will know that the way you calculate the power output of a car is the torque, so the moment, multiplied by the angular velocity, the turning speed of the crankshaft. And that's exactly the same in these graphs. So it's your moment, so the magnitude of this graph, multiplied by the angular velocity, effectively the slope, the gradient of these graphs. So if I pick an area here where there is a large moment and a relatively fast rate of moment, you see a large amount of power. Or if you take this graph, for example, look, this patient's knees barely moving at all in stance phase, no movement, 0 gradient, 0 power. Okay, so that's just a moment. This isn't strength, this is mechanical power, true mechanical power, joules per second or watts. They're normalized for weight. All right, so but we won't talk too much about powers because it's unlikely to come up in the exam. And then we can create some gait reports, which look very cool, and we can send these to parents and physios and make recommendations on various different things. So that's kind of what we do in the gait lab. So this is a quick, how am I doing for time? 25 minutes, okay. So this is some pathological gait now. So this, actually, let me just go back. Like I said, it works slightly better in this view. So this is a the gentleman with cerebral palsy. I'll play at full speed to start off with, and you can see there's definitely something wrong with that foot, particularly the right side. So he's got diplegia actually, but it's asymmetrical, so his right side's worse than his left. And there's a few things that we look at when we're trying to describe gait. And in the exam, and also in your clinical practice, when you don't have access to a gait lab, you're really going to only see gait, do visual gait analysis. Some of you might do a video, I suppose, but very few of you will actually go through and get 3D gait analysis. So most of the rest of this talk is going to be generally about the visual interpretation of gait. And there's a few things that we look at, and I'm going to go through these a few times as well, because it kind of gives you a structure about how to look at gait. So the first thing is initial contact. So let's do a right foot gait cycle. So what hits the ground first? So you can see on this case, actually let's go to sagittals for him. I think it's better. So let's go to again a right foot. Okay, so let's go back a few. There we go. We'll just spin on. Fine. Oh no, too fast. There we go. Good. All right. So no ground reaction vector yet. So nothing's touched the ground. And you can see that as soon as the ground reaction, that's initial contact. So initial contact in his case is with the forefoot. In fact, it's almost entirely with the fifth ray, but forefoot contact. And then spin on. Now watch. Look at his knee. Remember what I showed you with Harry, my son. When it got to mid stance, the ground reaction vector was through the middle of the knee. You see with this chap, his ground reaction vector is always behind the knee. So that is causing a flexion moment. And the only thing that can stop the knee buckling is now his quads. So this lad, who's already weak because of cerebral palsy, has to use his quadriceps to keep his knee straight during mid stance. And even as stance progresses, flexion moment, flexing moment, flexing moment, flexing moment, never gets that ground reaction vector in front of the knee, always stays behind it. So then for these persons, we say the plantar flexion knee extension couple is impaired, or even in this case, absent. He cannot get his ground reaction vector in front of the knee, and therefore cannot get that extending movement. And therefore, the only thing that's going to keep his knee straight is his quads, which is going to increase the energy expenditure. It's going to pull on his patella, give him a patella alta, stretch out his knee ligament, his patella tendon. If I asked any of you healthy individuals to stand or walk with your knees bent like this for a long period of time, you're going to get, your quads are going to start burning. It's going to get really uncomfortable. And this kid's already weak because of his cerebral palsy. So this is what we mean by an absent plantar flexion knee extension couple. And the knee just stays bent, stays bent, stays bent, and then carries on. So that's kind of how it. And then if we look at his graph, let's go to this one. So look at this. So this is his knee flexing moment. So we've just shown you on the video how he never gets a knee extension moment as the normal one. It just stays flexing. And his knees, obviously there without the knee extending moment, can't extend. This is where they should go. They should go, your knees should go almost to full extension by mid stance and terminal stance. But in his case, they just stay bent. They stay bent. Now, what's really interesting about this lad is that clinically, so you examine him on the couch, his knees come fully straight. So this is not fixed flexion contractures. Each grid line here is 10 degrees. That's 10, 20, 30, between 30 and 40 degrees. This is not fixed knee flexion contractures. On the couch, his knees fully extend. So why is this happening? Why can't he do that? It's entirely because he cannot get his ground reaction vector in front of the knee. Okay, so what do? So we come along and we prescribe him an orthotic. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the overlay video of this, but it's still fairly convincing. So now look at his, let's get his right foot. So right foot initial contact. So now he gets a heel strike. Previously, his right foot, it was the forefoot that hit the ground first. So he's now got a first rocker. Now watch what happens to his knee now. So now the knee, shorts get slightly away, but now the knee straightens, 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 until almost now to full extension at toe off. So we've taken him from being in a crouched position to getting his knee straight, and that's just because of the orthotic prescription. No surgery has happened here, no Botox, nothing else. Just by controlling the plantar flexion knee extension couple. This is an AFO with some wedging. He's got a little bit of a rocker on his sole. So just by orthotics, we've transformed his gait. And so if you watch him walk now, he's now got. Just watch that knee. So the knee just extends really nicely during the stance phase now. Bang, much more natural gait. Definitely still abnormal, but completely different to this gait. And because now he doesn't need to use his quadriceps muscles, it'll be much more energy efficient for him. So he doesn't need to now burn his quadriceps every time he stands. and it will hurt less because he's not pulling on his patella tendon every time and causing patellofemoral pain. So that's how orthotics can be used. Right then, so just to finish off the sort of this part of the chat, I've got just a few tips for the FRCS thing. So most examiners are not Gait lab trained paedopods who treat kids with CP. Most will be like a foot and ankle surgeon or a knee surgeon or a hip surgeon. So you do have to play a little bit to your crowd. And if you see an obvious gait abnormality, then just say so. So if you see a Trendelenburg gait or an antalgic gait or a short leg gait or a high stepping gait, all the classical gaits, just say so. I don't think there's any necessity to go through the sort of details of gait analysis if it's a fairly obvious gait abnormality. But this is, sorry, that's my alarm telling me to finish. But if you do see a really obvious, if you don't see an obvious abnormality, then you do need a structure for how to visually describe someone's gait. And this is how I would propose that you do it. So get used to watching a patient walk away from you and looking at their right-hand side. So that's looking at their right hip, knee, foot, and ankle. Then get the patient to turn around and walk back towards you, but carry on looking at the right-hand side from your point of view. So now you're looking at the patient's left-hand side. So you're watching their right leg as they walk away, watching their left leg as they walk back towards you, but you're always looking to the right. See what hits the ground first. So initial contact is with the, whatever it is. Then the next thing to look at is stability and stance phase. So are they wobbling from side to side? Do they need you to use a stick or a cane, or God forbid, do they fall or have to use the wall? So what's the stability like in stance phase? Are they clearing in swing phase? And there's two things you need to clear. You need to clear the floor and your other leg. So is clearance adequate? Then in order for you to progress through and walk, you have to have a step length, and the step length should be either normal, increased, or reduced. Some people try and dramatically increase their step length to make up for poor cadence. They effectively can't walk as many steps per minute, but take a longer steps. Most people with gait problems actually have a reduced step length. They don't progress as much, and it is a judgment. You can't say definitely what's normal, and only sort of say it if you think it's really abnormal. And then so you can build that into one sentence. You say, as you said, this patient's initial contact is healed. There's good stability in stance phase, adequate clearance in swing, and there appears to be normal step length. One sentence, and you describe those 4 bits of the gait cycle. You need to do that for each leg, left and right. And then the last thing to comment on is something called energy conservation. So energy conservation is a somewhat nebulous term. Well, it's not nebulous, it's actually physically defined in terms of oxygen consumption, but you can't do that in visual gait analysis. So you have to kind of just sort of cap it off with a statement of what you think the patient's energy expenditure of walking would be like. Generally speaking, the energy expenditure of walking is to accelerate your center of mass. You have to accelerate your center of mass forwards to progress anywhere, but you shouldn't really have to accelerate left, right, or up and down, or accelerations in forwards and backwards in the sort of transverse plane. So if you do see big trunk sways, so from side to side, or the patient's going, hiking up and down, so they've got a foot drop on the other side, so they have to lift their leg up high, then you can sort of say, actually, there appears to be increased energy expenditure or reduced energy conservation. So just to go back, initial contact is with the heel, usually. There is good stability in stance phase, adequate clearance in swing, increased step length, and there appears to be good energy conservation. And that gives you something to say if you cannot obviously see an abnormal gait pattern. And it sounds intelligent, and certainly if you're speaking to someone who's used to looking at gait, it's kind of the sentence that they want to hear, those 5 things. So initial contact, clearance in swing, stability in stance, energy conservation, and step length. They're the kind of 5 things that you want to kind of bring into your gait discussion for visual gait analysis. All right, and we'll get a chance to practice that when we do some Viva questions. The next top tip is just not to get too muddled with the gait phases. There's lots of different ways of describing gait phases. Most gait labs and gait analysts use Perry's phases, Jacqueline Perry, who described these back in the 60s and 70s. And they're load response, mid stance, terminal stance, pre-swing, and then initial, mid, and terminal swing. And generally speaking, load response is your first 10%, and mid stance and terminal stance are 20% each. And then pre-swing is your last 10% of stance phase. And stance phase accounts for 60 to 62% of your cycle. And then initial, mid, and terminal swing, 13% for each of them, and that's your 40% of swing phase. So these are the phases that most gait analysts use. However, most of the time, certainly if you're doing foot and ankle clinical vivas or with a non-gait surgeon, they talk about rockers. We've kind of mentioned these already. So you've got your first rocker, which is during load response, actually only the first half of load response, and that's your ankle going from neutral to plantar flexion, eccentric contraction of tibant. Your second rocker, which is a big chunk, 40%. This is your foot flat to the ground with your tibia advancing over the top, so your ankle is dorsiflexing, eccentric contraction of gastrocilius. And then your third rocker, pre-swing, which is your ankle plantar flexion, concentric contraction of gastrocilius or elastic recoil, but I'd probably just stick to concentric contraction. And then swing phase, initial, mid, and terminal, just split into thirds. So these are kind of how a lot of sort of non-gait analysis orthopods will talk about things. And the other thing you might come across is double support, single support. So you've got first double support, which is load response, and you've got both feet on the ground. Then first single support, so that one foot in stance phase, the other foot in swing phase. Then you've got second double support, so this is in pre-swing, so the end of stance phase for one limb, and the other limb is now in load response. And then your second single support during swing phase. So sometimes you'll see these phases described: double support, single support, double support, single support. And there are other ways, right? So there are different ways of describing gait. Probably from your point of view in the exam, most people, certainly non-gait surgeon, non-gait analysis orthopods, will talk about the ankle rockers to describe the phases of stance phase. So again, play to your crowd. If you're a pediatric viva and you know it, then go to these. But I wouldn't spend too much time learning these unless you're particularly interested. Right then, so I think I'm gonna stop yakking there because that's most of the gait chat. So David and Hanny, I don't know if there's been any questions so far. Let me just stop sharing for a sec.
No,
there's no questions. I can just carry on
in the chat group, have there, Hanny?
No.
No? Okay.
David, you're muted, I think.
Oh. Only one question here. So what's happening in running?
Yes.
I can't see a chat, so I don't know. I can't see.
Oh, no, don't worry. So what happens in running?
David, you're still muted. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm still muted.
What's happening in running? Do you hear me?
Oh, wait a second. I've got the chat open now. Okay, I see. So one question about running and one question about Crouchgate. All right, I'm going to slightly gloss over running. So it's not that it's not important. It's just I've never seen a exam question about running. It is a very sort of specialist topic. One of the kind of important things to remember is that for normal walking, you need surprisingly little muscle strength. So all of the reserve you've got, so you only need 15% of your maximum voluntary contraction strength of your gluteals, for example, to walk. So that's only really equates to strength 3 out of 5. So just anti-gravity strength is enough for walking on flat, even ground at a normal pace. So running is where now you need all that reserve force. That's when you really do need your quads and your glutes to be functioning. So kids with cerebral palsy might just be able to walk, but can't do anything. Can't run, for example, because that just takes way too much muscle strength. We sometimes get runners in our gait lab, but it is fairly rare. So I'm not going to say too much more about running. Next question, can you explain Crouchgate? Yes, I can explain Crouchgate. Right, let's just go back to this lad because it's not far off this chat. Oh no, his. Okay, so Crouchgate is quite a malignant gait pattern. And there's usually 3 things wrong during Crouchgate. The hip is too flexed, the knee is too flexed, and the ankle is dorsiflexed. Now, the interesting thing about this chap is that if you've seen the videos already, actually, to be fair, it was this lad here. Someone should have unmuted themselves and shouted at me. All right, never mind. So this chap. So just going back to Crouchgate because it's quite important. I'll just repeat myself a little bit. So this was this chap that we saw before. So midfoot break. So forefoot in contact with the ground, hind foot not. So that's that rubber crowbar. He hasn't got a rigid foot. So even though his heel's lifting, his forefoot's in contact with the ground. Ground reaction vector behind the knee flexion moment here. And if you trace that up and you saw his hip, it would be in front of the hip. So knee flexing moment, hip flexing moment. Look at the graphs. We've got a hip flexing moment, double or triple normal. And look at his knee graph. And we've got, knee graph, massive knee flexing moment, whereas it should be an extending moment. So this is Crouchgate in a nutshell. Knee flexion, hip flexion, ankle dorsiflexion. Although in his case, it's not ankle dorsiflexion, it's midfoot dorsiflexion. His midfoot is broken, it's failing. And that will get worse and worse and worse with time. Quads will get weak, knee will bend more, moment gets bigger, quads have to work even harder, and you get this vicious circle of progressive knee flexion until eventually you can't stand anymore. So I'm really sorry, I forgot. I was yakking on about Crouchgate without sharing my screen, but I think that hopefully you got the gist. Let me go back to the Zoom thing. Blah, blah, blah. We cannot see it. Blah, blah, blah.
Can you hear us, by the way?
Go back a sec.
Steve?
So I can't hear you, David. I can see that you're talking, David, but I can't hear you.
Yeah. Name of system.
Oh, maybe that's something on my end. Hold on. So can you, David, can you stick your hand up if you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
I wonder if have I accidentally muted the audio. David, say something.
Hello.
Oh, that's better. Oh shit!
Yeah.
I must have muted my audio. So I literally couldn't hear you or see you. What a tip. All right, never mind. Okay, so Crouchgate have done that. Yeah, common gaits and clinical relevance. So yeah, so the common gaits you're going to get in your exam is, I suppose, antalgic is probably the commonest. So shortened stance phase. Then you might see Trendelenburg, and I don't think I need to explain that to you guys. You all know what an antalgic gait looks like. So someone who's trying to get their weight off the affected side, so shortens their stance phase on that side. And I think you all know what a Trendelenburg gait looks like. TA lengthening. Oh, that's a fantastic question. So TA lengthening not work for Crouchgate. So right, let's just go. I'm going to share my screen again before I forget. Otherwise, so let's go back to this. So this is why this used to be called iatrogenic gout. So let's go back to this chap here because he's quite a good example of this. So let's just go to initial contact there. Right. Okay. So initial contact. So initial contact there with the forefoot, and his heel just transiently hits the ground. The only thing now at this stage that's going to try and keep that ground reaction vector in front of the knee is gastroc pulling like crazy, effectively retarding the forward progress of your tibia, keeping that ground reaction vector in front of the knee and causing knee extension. So initially, a tiptoe walking gait is an adaptive response. Okay, so imagine if he had a flat-footed gait. The origin of the ground reaction vector, let's go back a frame actually, if we can. There we go. No, let's go forward a bit. So he's got initial contact with the foot, right? Okay. So at this stage in the normal gait cycle, it should be a heel strike, okay, and then coming down the foot. So the origin of the ground reaction vector in normal gait will be back here somewhere at this part of the gait cycle, going up that way. So let's spin on a sec. So because he can't straighten his knee, an adaptive response to in early crouch gait is to go up onto your toes. And that's to try and get the origin of your ground reaction vector as forward as possible. So you can see at this point here, it's just going through, maybe just in front of the knee. So that is helping initially to keep in front of his knee. Now he fails because he's got that midfoot break, so he just kind of collapses. But the initial toe walking gait, if you've got crouch, is a protective response. It's almost like exaggerating your plantar flexion knee extension coupled. I remember we said the plantar flexors is what's extending your knee. So by going up onto tiptoes, it's exaggerating that response. It's getting your ground reaction vector as forward as possible. So if I then as a surgeon go, oh, wait a second, this kid's walking on his toes, and go and cut their Achilles tendons, I've just put them into iatrogenic crouch. So I've just now taken away their adaptive response. And it's a bit like this chap here. He hasn't got his Achilles cut, but he's broken at the midfoot. So I've taken away their adaptive response and put them into iatrogenic crouch. So it's incredibly important in early crouch gait, if you see a toe walker, to find out whether or not that's a genuine gastrocilious tightness or whether it's due to early crouch gait. And you need a careful clinical examination. So you need to do Silver-Scold's test to see what their genuine range of motion is at the ankle. And some of these kids that go up onto their tiptoes, they've got a fantastic range of ankle motion when you examine them clinically. They haven't got any tightness or spasticity. But you examine their quads and they've got weak quads, or they've got a hip flexion contracture or an early knee flexion contracture. And then in those ones, if you cut the Achilles tendon, you take away their adaptive response and you put them into crouch gait. It was so-called iatrogenic crouch. And it was done quite a lot by orthopedic surgeons in days of yore before we had gait analysis and we really understood this concept. So you've got to be careful with cutting people's Achilles tendons. You've got to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Now, lots of kids do have genuine TA tightness and Achilles tendon contraction, and for them, releasing their gastrocs or muscle lengthening or tendon lengthening is the right thing to do. But you've got to be sure, and that's what gait analysis is useful for. What are we looking for? Crouchgate, we've done that. TA lengthening.
The next sort of questions are about AFOs. So can you explain the biomechanical basis of an AFO in different pathological gaits?
Yeah, okay. So there are a number. AFOs are complicated. So an orthotist takes it's a 3-year degree. You're not expected to know details of ankle foot orthoses. You are expected to know some principles. And there are lots of different types of ankle foot orthosis. The commonest ones in cerebral palsy or gait improvement are a fixed ankle AFO, so literally just a rigid device that goes behind the ankle, below the knee and behind the ankle and down the foot, and it goes around the back. And that's the kind of simplest type of ankle foot orthosis. And the idea is, and remember we talked about this plantar flexion knee extension couple. So if we go to, let's just share my screen again. Oh, where's Zoom gone? I should just keep my leave my screen sharing on, shouldn't I? All right, so let's look at this guy with his AFOs on. So he's got a no, sorry, that's not before his AFOs. Where's the one with his AFOs? I thought it was that one. Yeah, that's the one. So he's got a fairly standard-ish AFO from where you look at it. It's just a posterior shell, goes inside the shoe, and it's got a shoe on top with a rocker sole on it. As a general rule of thumb, AFOs and footwear are prescribed in combination, so you don't really prescribe one without the other, except in the most simple circumstances. And a lot of it is about controlling the plantar flexion knee extension couple. So in his case, we've just prescribed that AFO to control his ankle movement, to stop that midfoot break. So he's got a rigid AFO. He's got, if you saw it, it'd have distal trim lines going in front of the malleoli. He's got a double laminate sole plate, so that sole is absolutely rigid from the AFO. All that dorsiflexion there is happening through the rocker sole that we provided him. So it's a rigid AFO. So we've now taken away his ankle movement. We're controlling it for him. And tuning of these, a lot of this is about setting up the angle here. So you can put little wedges in, you can set the angle of the ankle in the AFO, the ankle of the bench ankle, and so forth. So you can set various angles to try and tune it. And we tune those in the lab to get it right. So that's the simplest type of AFO. Someone mentioned in the chat about GROs, so ground reaction orthoses. So this is kind of a next step up for Crouchgate. So if you've got someone whose crouch can't be controlled with a simple AFO, the next thing you tend to prescribe is a ground reaction orthosis. So you guys will have seen them, they've got a front shell. So they've got a rigid thing around the front as well as the back. It's usually in a kind of clamshell design. So you bring it over and then there's straps to hold it in place. And this is now an even more rigid way of stopping that tibia falling forwards. So to try and keep the tibia back during stance phase. That's in barefoot. So a GRO, effectively, you've got a front shell here pushing that tibia back, getting that knee straight, getting that ground reaction vector start going in front of the knee. But if you think about it, you can only push on the, this is the pretibial area. You've got your bone right under there. You can only push on there so hard before you'll start causing pain and discomfort. And you are limited to how hard you can push on the skin. So eventually people with grouch often becomes unsplinterable. But ground reaction orthosis is kind of the next step up after an AFO, predominantly for Crouchgate. So this chap, for example, if that AFO wasn't so effective, then GRO would be the next thing. And he's only young now, he's only 9 or 10. As he grows, in the next 3 or 4 years, he's going to go through puberty, he's going to get a lot heavier. And you can imagine that then no longer becoming sufficient. That strap will just give up, the Velcro won't be sufficient, and then a GRO may actually well be required for him. So AFO and GRO. The next type is hinged splints. So these aren't often prescribed in cerebral palsy because we normally need to take over the patient's ankle movement, but they are sometimes prescribed for things like, things like a foot drop splint, for example. So a foot drop splint, you want to stop the foot plantar flexing and swing phase, but you want to still allow it to dorsiflex. So there are different ways of doing it. You can have hinges here. You can have what's called a leaf spring. So you have the cutaways behind the malleoli. So it allows it to move. You can also, if patients don't have a midfoot break, you don't have to have quite a rigid sole plate. You can just have a single laminate sole plate. and so forth. So there's lots of different options. And again, you guys aren't orthotists, and you're not expected to be orthotists. And when we do our tuning in the Gait lab, we have an orthotist there. I don't know enough, and I do this all the time. I don't know enough to the intricacies of all the different materials, all the different designs, all the different sort of tuning options you can have. And it's not just tuning in the sagittal plane. You can put posting and so forth to tune in the coronal plane, and all sorts of things that the orthotist can do. And you're not really expected to know that. Remember, what's the quote for the exam? Your test is a day one DGH consultant in the generality of the specialty. Detailed knowledge of orthotics is not required, just general principles. All right, any other questions, David?
I think you actually answered all the other questions. Most of them were about the GRFO brace and the spring one. As you said, we're not expected to know that in that much detail, as we're not orthotists. And it is, as you've shown, it's a multidisciplinary approach, because you're there working with the orthotist, and that's often the case with a lot of subspecialties. We have to work with our other colleagues in order to get the right solution. And I think that's the key thing to state in the exam.
So I think knowing some things they can and can't do is helpful. So as a general rule of thumb, if by the time you start getting fixed contractures in your knee, particularly more than 10 degrees, there's almost no point in prescribing orthotics to try and improve knee movement, because you're just fixed. No orthotic's going to be able to suddenly straighten a fixed flexion contracture. And then I suppose the other thing to just be aware of is the accommodative orthotics. So sometimes when your foot is so bad or your knee is so bad, you're kind of building the splint around the patient's own fixed deformities. So we've got some kids with really bad cave-varus feet that aren't really candidates for surgery, but you just want to give them a stable platform to walk on. So we give them generally an accommodative AFO. We build a splint around the foot, and then make a special sole so that the foot is so the sole of the shoe is flat to the ground, even though the foot inside the shoe might be in sort of profound adductus equinus and so forth. So they're the kind of accommodative splints, just to try and make life easier. We're not trying to correct anything. We're not tuning it in the lab to get ground reaction vectors in the right place or anything like that. We're just trying to make the patient's life a little bit easier. So I suppose an accommodative versus a corrective AFO might be another sort of general principle, if you see what I mean.
Let me think. One question from Jenna is, how often do you recommend gait analysis for children with cerebral palsy?
So I do it all the time, because I've got a gait lab and I enjoy it. So I don't, it's difficult to, okay, so let's talk about a bit I don't like talking about this because it's horrible, but all the drawbacks of gait analysis. There are lots of drawbacks of gait analysis. So like I said, we don't really understand how humans walk. So all the interpretation we do sounds very clever, but we're operating from quite a poor general knowledge point of view. So the interpretation of gait analysis is really quite different. There's a lovely study done in Toronto where they looked at gait analysis from lots of different laboratories. So the same gait data, same videos sent to different laboratories, and they come up with different conclusions, different recommendations. They also did quite a nice study. This was in McMaster, again in Canada, where they looked at so they looked at people, they randomized trials. So they showed some surgeons, they randomized people so the surgeon could see all of the patient's gait data, or the surgeon could only see the video. And then obviously recommendations made, and they found lots of differences there as well. Then they did another one. This was a North American study where they showed the same, they did intra-observer reliability for the same surgeon being showed the same data 6 months apart, and they get different interpretations. Different labs have different normal data sets, so it's not, unfortunately, it's not standardized like an MRI. So generally speaking, an MRI is the same, or a CT scan is the same more or less as if you do it in one hospital as another. Gait analysis isn't different. Different labs have different setups, different models. The musculoskeletal model we use is different to some other labs use. Some use treadmills, for example. Others use gait labs like we've got. Some use inertial measurement units. These are basically things you strap onto the muscles without 3D, without motion captures. There's lots of problems with the variability of how gait analysis is done and how it's interpreted, which makes cast iron recommendations of how it should be used difficult. However, there are some general principles. Certainly in CP surgery, if you're proposing multi-level surgery, there are very, very few paedopods that I know around the country who will be happy to do that without gait analysis. Also, for monitoring responses, it really is the only objective way of measuring gait. So if I do an intervention in cerebral palsy, whether it's Botox or orthotics or surgery, one of the best ways I can find out if it's made any difference is gait analysis. So I use it sort of pre-operatively for decision making, and then post-operatively to monitor outcomes. And I use it a lot because I've got a gait lab and I'm interested. Other people might use it less, but there are no absolute indications. But the closest I can get to an absolute indication is single event multi-level surgery and CP.
A few sort of straightforward ones, I hope. So, do we always need shoe modifications for AFO and Grapho splints?
Mostly. So certainly if you are using a rigid AFO where you're effectively taking away the patient's own ankle movement or foot movement, then it's a bit like having an ankle fusion. And if you give someone an ankle fusion, you need to change their shoe weight, particularly providing some kind of rocker. And there's lots and lots of different rockers. You can have point loading rockers, you can have rounded rockers, you can choose the part of the foot that the rocker occurs in. You can even have rockers in front of the forefoot, if you like, with flare outs and so forth. So yeah, so generally speaking, if you're prescribing an AFO that takes away the patient's own ankle movement, then you need to prescribe a shoe to go with it. Otherwise, they're not going. If they just buy an off-the-shelf trainer, it's not going to work very well. So the vast majority of our patients get AFO footwear combination, AFO FC.
Okay. And can a simple AFO work for idiopathic toe walkers, or is it just effective for crouch or jumper gaits?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So idiopathic toe walking is a difficult topic. So if you look carefully enough, probably up to 70%, 70, of patients you've labeled as idiopathic toe walkings do have some pathology. And it's usually a very mild cerebral palsy or something like that. However, I would strongly advise you not to go hunting for it. If you've got a kid who's effectively functionally normal, but just walks on their toes, you going hunting for cerebral palsy or any other thing is probably not really going to help their life. So it's not really beneficial for insurance or future job prospects and so forth if you've got cerebral palsy in your notes, particularly if it has really no meaningful effect on you. So first thing to think is a lot of idiopathic toe walkers aren't idiopathic. Next thing to say about idiopathic toe walkers is probably they're best left alone as much as possible. Physiotherapy might be helpful. Teaching them a few ankle dorsiflexing exercises and so forth might be useful. Serial castings, sometimes you can do it for 4 to 6 weeks, just gradually stretch them out, particularly when they go through growth spurts. But actually, if you put a kid who's functionally normal into an AFO, you'll make them worse. And then also, if you think about it, if you take a kid who's neurotypical and you put them in a rigid AFO, not only does that control the sagittal plane, also the coronal plane. So it means you're taking away their own proprioception, you're taking away the ability for their ankle to develop, particularly at young years. So I'm very, very against using AFOs willy-nilly. Rigid AFO is like an ankle fusion. It's almost like an entire pan-talar fusion. You're taking away everything from the hindfoot, not only in the sagittal plane, but also in the coronal plane. And so, yeah, be very, very careful. Now, if you're really struggling and you've got a really bad toe walker, then maybe some kind of hinged or leaf spring AFO to allow them to move. But I would try and not. And if they're really bad, if they're so bad they're such high up on their tiptoes, then you probably should go looking for another diagnosis, refer them to a developmental pediatrician or something like that, because often a lot of them aren't idiopathic.
Okay, and I think last one, are there any other type of pathologies where you found gait lab analysis useful?
Okay, yeah, so a couple. So in the adult world, so we've used it a few times now in Parkinson's and stroke. Gait velocity is quite a good predictor of severity in Parkinson's disease. You've got that typical slow shuffling gait, and you can actually use that to quantify the severity and response to treatment. We've used it in diabetics, particularly in diabetic feet, where the patients don't have their own sensation. So getting their orthotics tuned properly, particularly with plantar pressures and foot pressures. So we can use a plantar pressure plate, which we've got in our lab, to see where patients, so the patients stand on it, and it gives you a pressure map of the sole of the foot. And so these patients don't have any of their own sensations. So we can say, actually, look, all the pressure is over the lateral base of fifth metatarsal or something like that. And then the orthotist can go away and make a total contact orthotic or something like that to try and account for that. So we've used it for things like that. The other thing we've used it for more in a research context is in hip and knee replacement. So we've got a guy called Andy Metcalf who's got an interest he's a knee surgeon by trade, academic knee surgeon, but also got a history of working in gait labs. So we've used it. We're trying to develop models of how the knee works. So we can, obviously in the Gait lab, we can model the knee in 3 planes at 100 frames a second and see really what the knee is doing during stance phase, pre and post knee replacement. So stuff like that. That's more a research context rather than a general use. And then the other time is in foot and ankles surgery, particularly people post fusion. So trying to work out what orthotics are best for them. So again, it's somewhat niche and it depends on your access. So if you've got a Gait lab in your hospital and you've got someone who's interested, then go and chat to them, and there's all sorts of avenues. And as I said before, gait analysis is one of the only objective ways of measuring gait. And so if you're doing, and most of what we do in orthopedics, certainly lower limb orthopedics, affects gait, and we're hoping to make people walk better. And if you want to show that definitively, then gait analysis can help with that. So yes, if you've got research ideas and so forth, then yeah, speak to your local Gait lab.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So